Today we have a very special guest, and one that I really can't keep secret because you guys voted on him. Yes, we have Brent Friedman, who wrote for the Clone Wars, especially the later seasons, and Star Trek Enterprise, Dark Skies, the reboot of Twilight Zone, and Mortal Kombat Annihilation. He's also a TV producer. I guess since Clone Wars, the bonus missions, or Season 6 partial, whatever you want to call it, is airing this weekend in Germany, and March 7th is going to be released on Netflix here in the States. I guess it's a perfect time to release this. So without further ado, let's listen to Brent Friedman as he discusses his work writing for television and a little bit about Star Wars The Clone Wars, especially what it's like to write in the Clone Wars writing room with George Lucas there giving you ideas. Enjoy.
This is Brent Friedman. I am a writer-producer, and I have worked in film and television and games for the last 25 years.
Excellent. So you've worked, at least from what I've seen from your list, early on you worked in a lot of games as a writer. Are these all horror games for the most part?
I've worked in some games. I've worked on independent features. I've worked on TV.
Okay.
I've worked on so many different things on so many different platforms. I lose track.
Okay. But from the looks of it, your first big break was Mortal Kombat Annihilation.
Yeah, that came actually right at about the same time that I got my first TV show on the air. So both of those things kind of in conjunction were definitely a big boost to my career.
Okay, and your first TV show was the 90s series Dark Skies.
Correct.
Okay, so I guess we'll start with Dark Skies. So a lot of people here, we love television, we love watching different shows, and the shows, created and written by and so on. How did you get this big break with Dark Skies? Did you, were you just lucky with who you approached, or what can you tell people about Dark Skies? Because it's, well, it's not a show I saw when I was a kid, but of course this was when I was like 10, so.
Yeah, so what happened was I teamed up with a established TV writer who was already in the business, had a number of credits to his name, and we started kicking around an idea, which at the time was, high concept Forrest Gump meets War of the Worlds. And we wanted to do a complete revisionist history of the 20th century based on the premise of what if aliens really did crash at Roswell? How would that have affected or impacted all of the big, historical events since 1947? And what if one person was right in the middle of that whole story and knew the truth? So that was kind of our, launch point, and we put together a massive, what they call a show Bible, which basically laid out, the concept with graphics. We put together a whole kind of faux briefing book from the agency that we were centering it around called Majestic 12. And we laid out a 5-year plan for what the series was. And then our agents were so excited about it, they took it out to a bidding war, and several networks bid on it, and we ended up going with NBC.
Awesome. So one thing I always wanted to know with show writers and show creators is, at least as far as your IMDb goes, it says you wrote 7 episodes, you did the story for 4, and you did the teleplay for 1. What exactly is the difference between writing an episode, the story, and the teleplay?
Well, first of all, don't believe anything you read on IMDb. It's a completely flawed system, unfortunately. Okay. It's basically they just take whatever they can find on the internet and post it, and then if you think that there's a problem with it, you have to pay to take control of your page, and then you have to prove that the changes that you want to make are correct. And it's very subjective and confusing and time-consuming, and I've tried over the years to take control of my own resume, and I just gave up. So, but to answer your question, there's no difference between a teleplay and a script credit, but the story credit is different in that you may come up with the idea and actually write an outline that gets approved and you get paid for it, but somebody else comes in and converts that outline or treatment into a script, in which case, when the credits are determined, you'll get the story credit and they'll get the teleplay credit. So that's different than just a pure written by credit, which says I did both the story and the script.
Ah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Cause I've seen the terms thrown about, and I've never been sure what the difference was.
Yeah. So that's what it means.
So with Dark Skies as a show creator, how much of the show would you say you've written then, as far as this one goes, since IMDb's wrong?
Right. Well, I think out of the 22 hours that were written, I wrote or co-wrote 12 of them.
Oh wow, that's pretty impressive. I think J.J. Abrams wrote 12 hours of any show he wrote, even like with 9 seasons.
Right. Well, J.J.'s not really a writer.
Ah.
So, he has in his past, but once he got successful enough, that was the first thing he gave up, simply because writing is the hardest job.
Okay. And then then from there, your first, at least big feature was Mortal Kombat Annihilation. Well, it's a sequel to a rather silly movie in general. When it came to writing that one, I was under the impression that this movie they were trying to rush out because the first one was unexpected, very unexpectedly big, because no one thought Mortal Kombat would be a big movie, at least watchable. Was this a rushed movie, and they just try to get people moving as quickly as possible, and that's why they didn't have cast and crew? Or how did this movie work as far as your end goes?
Well, I knew the producer of the first film pretty well. I was a good friend of his, and he had read my Dark Skies pilot and loved it, and he was, because of the success of the first Mortal Kombat, looking for a writer. So my Dark Skies partner and I said, sure, we'll do it. I'm a video game player, so I was obviously a fan of the game, and the movie was fun. But what happened was there was a rush to get it out, obviously, and but more importantly, the bigger problem was at that point because of the success of the first game, the game makers, not the game makers, but the guys who created Mortal Kombat, the game, had a lot more. Their new deal had a lot more say and script approval than they did the first time around, and additionally, so that really, let's just say, slowed down the writing process and complicated it to unnecessary degrees. And also, we were working with a first-time director who was the DP, the director of photography, on the first film, and he was being promoted to director, but he'd never directed a lot. Usually the development process is guided by a director with a vision, and he, I think, honestly, was just a little over his head. So those two things really conspired to make that a difficult process. Not to mention that I was right in the middle of trying to write and produce Dark Skies when I was writing that script.
That makes sense. I grew up with those movies, and the second one is definitely closer to the video game. So you said the second one, the game company had more say in what it was like compared to the first one, and that explains why it has the video game music along with the video game characters and the way they talk over the first one, which was more its own thing set in Mortal Kombat.
Yes, correct.
Okay. And, just looking at some of your work, just moving through, because right at the beginning we'll do a little overview of how everything works. You also wrote part of The Twilight Zone when it came back in 2000. Were you a big fan of The Twilight Zone growing up?
I was. It was very influential on me. That and The Outer Limits, the original Outer Limits. And, in fact, I just got a certificate in the mail 2 weeks ago from the Writers Guild saying that all the Twilight Zones combined, collectively known as the Twilight Zone, were voted one of the top 100 TV series of all time. So it was cool that I got to work on a version of it.
So when they came back in 2000, I know this was a very risky thing because the original Twilight Zone is very classic in its look. It's known for being black and white. It's known for being, it's a product of its times, with paranoia and everything. Was it really hard approaching it in 2000 and 2002? I guess this was post 9/11, but approaching it then when paranoia and the Cold War and so on was all done, and it was going to be in color, and was it really hard approaching it in the new modern style?
I mean, it was, because a lot of like you said, a lot of the stories in the original Twilight Zone were not necessarily ripped from the headlines, as they say, but were certainly reflective of the cultural times. And when we did the reboot, it was harder to find kind of those central themes of paranoia and nationalism and race, and those there wasn't. They were more diffused. They weren't as clear cut. So it was definitely harder in the beginning to find stories, and then eventually, we settled in on a few big ideas. We replaced the fear of communism with the fear of technology, things like that. We also went back and watched a lot of the old episodes over and over again. And one of the things that happens when you do that is you realize, we all have a very selective memory of what the first Twilight Zone was. We remember our favorite episodes, and we think all the episodes were like that. But there was a real diversity of episodes when you go back and watch them. And some were much more effective than others. And so we just decided, well, we're going to just tell stories that resonate with us and not try and worry too much about strictly adhering to what the old Twilight Zone did, because it was a model for its times. But, we still had to make a show reflective of the era that we were living in.
Do you, we know that Twilight Zone reboot didn't last very long. Do you feel that like a show like the Twilight Zone would actually survive nowadays if they tried approaching it again?
They are trying to.
Do you think it'll actually work?
I think it just depends. I think that we made a decision. I say we, but it wasn't really my decision, but I was on the writing staff of a show that decided, let's do an hour-long show comprised of 2 half hours. That was kind of trying to be in the spirit of the original show. And I think that's confusing for audiences, right? Who, you sign on for an hour, and at the half-hour mark, you're changing characters, you're changing storyline and whatnot. It works great in syndication when you can just watch a half hour and there's no connection to the other half hour. But I do feel that if they use that same format, it'll be tricky. And it's really also hard to extend a Twilight Zone episode to an hour. We experimented, and I think we did one episode like that. So the format itself is tricky, because you want the show to present an idea, explore that idea, and then wrap it up and give your Twilight Zone kind of twist within 30 minutes, which really on television is 22 minutes. Those are hard stories to tell. Having sat in a room, and it only lasted one full season, but that was 44 episodes that we had to come up with, 44 stories. That was a lot. That was hard to do. So I think it can work. I think, the one thing that was always criticized in our show, and to some degree rightly, was the choice to have Forrest Whitaker be the host. If you think about it, one of the most indelible aspects of the first show was Rod Serling himself. And how do you replace that? Who in this, contemporary culture could be that stand-in for Rod Serling? Furthermore, Rod Serling was the writer of most of the episodes and the creator of the show. So he wasn't just an actor paid to come in and talk about the show. These were stories that were near and dear to his heart, and that was part of what made his presentation of the episodes so interesting, not to mention his cool kind of vocal affectations and whatnot. So I think a lot of it's going to depend on the format they use and who they choose as the host.
That makes an awful lot of sense, because that is one of the things I did notice is the original one. Yeah, the host is very much, when you think of the Twilight Zone, you think of him and you think of the music.
Yeah.
Everything else is just, episodes. But with a new one, it's really hard putting a finger on what is memorable about it, other than, of course, it's the Twilight Zone and the music pops back in.
Right.
Okay, so we're going to move on just a little bit. So with Twilight Zone, you said there was a little issue with, expanding stories and creating, longer episodes, and there's the format issue. But next, you worked on Star Trek Enterprise. You wrote some, and you were consulting producer on others. So the first question I want to have is, what is the difference between a consulting producer, a supervising producer, all these different levels of producers? Because you seem to have done almost every level of producer I can see.
Well, the main difference is it's a different word, and it's a different pay scale. Honestly, that there's not that much difference. It's more about what your experience is and what your role on the team is. And that may or may not align with what your title is. On Enterprise, I was brought in because trying to remember the events. I had just done Twilight Zone for the network, UPN, and they really liked my episodes. And so when Star Trek Enterprise was struggling with ratings, they requested that the producers bring on some fresh blood in the writing room. So I got asked to be on the show. And then when I came in, I had, I was a Star Trek fan, but I was frankly really more of a fan of the original show. There were things I liked about the Next Generation and Voyager and Deep Space Nine and whatnot, but my real allegiance was to the original show, and so I had some ideas on how I thought we could inject, some of the original spirit into Enterprise, and the producers seemed interested in that when I went in and met with them before I got the job. I also thought that it would be cool if we could, do something different and have an overarching story, which was something that, maybe they had a little bit of that in Deep Space Nine, but they certainly haven't really done it in Star Trek for a whole season. So when the show began and I was actually on the staff, it was quickly made apparent to me that they really weren't interested in embracing the original series at all. But they did like the idea of extending, a series-long arc into the show. So that was one of my main jobs on that show, was just to kind of help come up with and design what the plan was for the entire season. I don't know if you're familiar with the show, but it was all centered around going into a very specific area of space called the Expanse and meeting a new race called the Xindi. And every episode took place in this new area of space with some form or another of interaction with the Xindi. And it was kind of a bold thing to do, but at the time, again, the ratings weren't great, so we decided to try something different, and it worked. The fans really seemed to like it once they got used to it. I actually didn't have the best of time working on the show because I just felt that, again, my interest in that universe was really rooted in more kind of the creative spirit of the original, and I didn't feel that that spirit really existed on the show. So I ended up having some creative differences with the people running the show and left after, I don't know, 3/4 of a season or something.
Do you feel, this last question about Star Trek, do you feel Star Trek is in a better place now as far as, where they can take it than it was when Enterprise was floundering and then Nemesis died a horrible death? Do you feel that Star Trek is in a better place now than it was back then, and it's better off for it? Or do you feel that Star Trek is... Cause I've had some fans that argue with me that saying Star Trek should have stayed dead rather than coming back, but you wrote on it, so I guess it's a good question to ask.
Well, my personal opinion is obviously it's doing fine from a financial standpoint. So you could say, well, then they made the right decision. Enough people like it to validate it. Um, to me, a lot like Twilight Zone, Star Trek was a product of its time. The stories they were telling were much more just kind of holding up a mirror to society. And so they were very relevant and topical stories. It was science fiction, only kind of in the trappings of the storytelling framework. But if you compare the original Star Trek to the last movie that just came out, there's almost no resemblance whatsoever, other than some terminology and a few bells and whistles. So is it better off? I don't know. It just depends on what you want out of Star Trek. I mean, I really liked the kind of intellectual exploration of ideas and themes and allegories that they had in the original. That was really cool to me. You don't really have any of that in the current Star Trek trajectory. So it's just become another big interchangeable action franchise in my mind.
Let's move to Star Wars, which you worked on several arcs in the Clone Wars. How do they approach people? Like, I've never met a Clone Wars writer. How do they choose writers, or how do they approach writers? And what was your initial reaction to being offered to work on Star Wars?
Well, okay. So what happened was I had actually right after Enterprise. Actually, is a good segue. I had gotten somewhat disenfranchised with working on TV shows, even though it's an extremely lucrative job, and I wanted to do my own things, and so I started a digital media company called Electric Farm Entertainment, and we produced a number of pretty high profile, high budget, original kind of transmedia properties, which was basically digital entertainment that was designed to work on as TV, online, mobile, interactive, the whole thing. And one of those shows I did with a friend of mine and Christian Taylor. We did a show for MTV and Verizon called Valemont. And Christian, and I don't remember how, got asked to be on Clone Wars. So he worked on season 3 of Clone Wars, and I was working with him at the time on Valemont, and I guess some of the writers that they had on season 3 didn't work out, so they were looking for new writers, and Christian recommended me. And so I met with the producers. They read a bunch of scripts that I'd written and liked them, and so I got brought on board. And in terms of what I felt about working on Star Wars, anything related to Star Wars, frankly, it was a dream come true. I'm of the age where I saw the original movie in 1977 when I was, I don't know, 12 or 13. And, just imagine seeing the original Star Wars with no other movie ever having come out like that before in a big theater with a crowd that was seeing it all for the first time. It was a transformative moment, to say the least. And so Star Wars had a huge impact on me as a writer, as a creative person. And I jumped at the chance. It was a strange job in that, unlike most TV shows where you get hired and you go and sit in a writing room for 8-9 months out of the year, and you break stories and you write scripts, and then you go to the set and you see things through, and then you go in the editing room and you get paid a lot of money. This was different in that they only needed the writing staff to come to Skywalker Ranch for 2 weeks out of the year, where we would all convene and do a super compressed story break session for the entire season in 2 weeks, and with George and Dave Filoni and Carrie Silver, the producer, and we would all be sitting in this room, from 9 to 6 every day, and breaking the entire season in outline form. And then at the end of that, we would all go home, go our separate ways. We'd get the outlines in the mail. We tried to pick and choose which arcs we wanted to write or which episodes. And then we would work from home by ourselves, sending in stuff, sometimes trading notes with the other writers and doing a couple rewrites. And then all of the production, all the editing, everything was done by Dave and his team up at Skywalker Ranch. So it was a very different show in that regard. It didn't, frankly, pay nearly as much as other shows. But in some ways, it was the best writing experience I ever had. I worked on the show for 4 seasons, even though 2 of those seasons will never see the light of day.
Sadly.
We did all the writing on them. So, I still feel like I worked on it, and we all got paid for all the work we did, even though, again, no one will ever see them. Well, maybe
we might see in comic form. We'll see some of them at least.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. That is one possibility, and that's why I'm always careful not to say too much about any of the.
I don't want some of this stuff spoiled. I just want to know it exists.
Yes, it does exist, and I guess I've said this before, and I know this is kind of salt in the wound, but each season, having been there right in the middle of things, each season that we worked on was better than the last. So, people said, season 5 of Clone Wars was so great. It's like, yeah, well, wait if you had seen season 6 or season 7 or season 8. There was just some really great stories that were coming down the pipeline. So I do hope that some of them somehow, find their way out to the fans through at least comics or novelizations, even, anything.
Yeah, and right now they're working on officializing the canon, and we know Lucasfilm never throws stuff away, so who knows when it'll pop up again.
Well, and I think the value of these is that these were stories that were essentially originated by George and overseen and developed with George, right? So theoretically, none of that will ever happen again.
It's true.
So these are kind of like the lost treasures, if you will.
So one thing I'm really curious about, you mentioned how there's the 2-week where you break down the season together with George and Dave. How does that season breakdown work? Like, are you there and George is throwing out ideas, or are all the writers throwing out ideas and you're all talking about it, asking George questions, how things work? Like, because I know Seth Green and the rest of them talked about when they broke Detours with George, they'd ask him, like, how do midichlorians work, as a joke, and he'd give them an hour-long answer and how this actually does work. And so on. Like, how does that 2-week process work? Like, does everyone give stories, or do they just discuss things? You ask questions of George how things work. I'm just really curious how do you do that, or how does that all function?
So, each of the 4 seasons that I went up there were a little different than the others, but they all had generally this framework. There was always a head writer. The first 2 years that I went up, it was Christian Taylor. It was my friend Christian. And then after Christian left the show, then it became Matt Miknovitz. So in either case, what would happen is the head writer would, in advance of the story conference, go up for a couple days to meet with Dave Filoni and George and Carrie, and they would start kicking around ideas. And most of them, from what I understand, I was never in the room, came from George. Stories that he wanted to tell, ideas that he had. And they would put those down into a paragraph or 2 on a piece of paper. And there would be, 8 of them? However many arcs there were. 4, I don't remember. 6, maybe 6, 7, 8. I can't remember. But there was a number. And so when we came to the writing conference, the first night that we got in, we would get in a late afternoon, and we wouldn't do any work or anything, but we'd all meet for a kind of gathering dinner and just chat. And sometimes we hadn't seen each other for a year, so that was kind of fun. And Skywalker Ranch is an amazing place, so it was always fun to be back there. We'd have this big dinner, and they'd hand out packets, like folders, that had the story ideas that we were going to work on during that conference. And then, the next day we'd meet at 9 a.m. and we'd start looking at all of those story ideas, and we'd talk generally about them. And then we would just kind of launch into one and say, okay, which one are we starting on? And then we'd go in. And so the stories themselves were pretty much generated by primarily George, to a certain extent Dave, and then Carrie and the head writer. Then what they became was really up to the group. And sometimes the story that was originally handed down in a paragraph or two would be more or less what we would end up writing and producing. And other times we would go in a completely different direction. And when I say that, I mean, it would be, oh, well, we're not going to use these two characters like was suggested. This is going to be an Anakin and Obi-Wan story, not a Rex and R2 story. But the plot or what was being investigated or the incident or whatever might be the same. So there'd be some aspects of it that we would keep, but we would really change significantly other aspects. And that was the creative collaborative process. And, anytime we were making changes, George, as you can imagine, had the final say-so. So once he agreed to something and liked it and it fit with what his vision was, then, we would move on. And sometimes that was easy and sometimes that was hard, as you can imagine. Some stories, came together relatively quickly and others were laborious. The one nice thing about the process was, although all the writers, as the stories were starting to unfold, and frankly, really from the first day that you read the stories, as a writer, you start kind of coveting a particular arc, saying, oh, this one's going to be really cool. That's the one I want to write. Well, of course, there may be one or two like super cool arcs, and everyone is sitting there thinking, well, that's the one I want to write. And obviously not everyone can write the same arc. So they never said, or they never allowed anyone to choose an arc until all of the stories had been broken out into like very detailed outlines. So there was a lot of interest in trying to get the best stories possible out of the room, because you never knew which one you were going to end up with. And after hours, we would all be kind of trying to probe each other and say, okay, so are you thinking about this Mace arc? Because it doesn't interest me. And someone might go, yeah, I'm kind of into the Mace arc. So it's like, okay, great. So are we saying that's the one you're going to end up wanting? So everyone was like trying to figure out who wanted what so that we wouldn't be disappointed. And then sometimes you'd get an arc, like a Jar Jar Binks arc, and everyone would not be interested in it. But somebody we knew had to write it. So it was kind of in our best efforts to make it the best it could be. But it was really difficult because clearly everyone's energy level in terms of trying to be creative was very low. So those type of arcs were very hard to break because no one was invested in them. And clearly it was hard even to get, Dave to a certain extent really excited about it. So, those were the ins and outs of the story conference. There's, so many other crazy details and memories and stuff that I have of it. But overall, it was just, I'd have to say, especially coming off of Star Trek, which was so limiting and so creatively stifling, this was the most creatively exhilarating writing experience I've ever had in 25 years.
So as a writer, I'm assuming every single writer brought a different set of talents, a different focus to the table so that they could divide them up, each episode up really well. What would you say was your main focus or main area of expertise or contribution to the writing team? Did you want to like have an original trilogy focus, an adventure focus? Some people had like really out of the box episodes. What was your, say, expertise or focus or your passion when it came to Star Wars?
That's a good question. I mean, it's hard for me to think of if I can really define a singular focus. I mean, so as for instance, Christian really wanted to write, he wanted to really do kind of crazy, unique things. So he wrote the Mortis trilogy, and he wrote the Younglings arc, and he wrote what I think you guys are going to see in bonus content, the Yoda arc. All of those are pretty wildly different. I mean, the Younglings maybe not so much, but certainly the Mortis arc and when you see it, the Yoda arc, are very, very atypical Clone Wars arcs. So I think my focus, and Matt Miknovitz really loves, hardcore action. So, he wrote, trying to remember he wrote the, I'm drawing a blank, the big, the big military arc in season 4. Umbara, right.
Yeah.
And he also wrote a couple big action oriented arcs that may or may not see the light of day. I don't know. Later on. So that was kind of his bent. And I think, for me, the episodes that I wanted to write, my first season, I really responded to kind of the Obi-Wan undercover arc because it felt like a lot of cool 70s movies that I liked. It had a kind of film noir retro quality to it. And so it was less about, necessarily exploring any aspects of the Star Wars universe as it was just bringing a certain sensibility that I have to the Star Wars universe. And then the second season, I wanted to do something completely different. Well, my second season, I'm sorry, for season 5. I wanted to do something completely different. My kids were big fans of the show. And my daughter's favorite character in the whole world is R2-D2. So I said, I really want to do an R2-D2 centric episode or arc. And it just so happened that season we ended up doing, the arc with R2 and the whole droid gang going on their big misadventure. So that was a real challenge because it wasn't like a lot of other Clone Wars episodes that season, and I knew it was going to be completely different. And for fans who just wanted the lightsabers and Maul, it was going to be like a fly that you couldn't get out of your room at night. This annoyance. It's like, just get to the good stuff. But I really wanted to write it for my kids, and it was one of the most fun stories to break because R2 is George's favorite character. So during that whole story break, he was so excited and into that arc. And I remember, and I still will always keep this, the hardest episode in that arc for me was the second episode, which was A Sunny Day in the Void. And I remember when we were breaking it, one of the reasons that none of the other writers wanted to write that arc was because George literally said at the beginning of the second episode, he's like, I want this to be an episode about nothing. I want the characters to have an existential crisis. And everyone went, oh no, what does that mean? So when we realized that basically nothing was going to happen in this whole arc other than a little bit of setup and whatnot, it was just going to be droids wandering around a vast expanse. I can tell you I was quivering in my boots. But it was actually really fun to write. And when I got the script back with George's notes, he had almost no notes, and he had written on the title page, great. And so at that point, I didn't care what anyone else thought of it, as long as I had made George happy. And he loved that episode. He loved the whole arc, but he really loved how that episode turned out. So that was kind of the high point for me. I went on to write again some really crazy arcs in season 6, 7, and 8, and my goal at that point was just to do something completely different than I had done the year or the year before. So I think the big theme for me was just to go in and have fun and do something that a story that I really enjoyed telling, that had some kind of personal hook for me, and that was completely different than what I had done the year before.
Okay. We need to begin wrapping up. I guess last question about Star Wars is, so I take it you have that George Lucas saying "good job" thing framed and immortalized in your house now?
I haven't framed it yet, but I do have it. I do have it kind of kept in a special place with all my first edition books and collectibles and whatnot.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it was great because we also each season, one of the best things about the job, and one of the things that I don't think people fully understand about Dave Filoni, is what he's a director and certainly was the primary creative force behind Clone Wars beneath George, but he's also a fabulous artist. And one of his biggest contributions to the story sessions were he would sit there, oftentimes very quietly, while we're all talking and breaking scenes and whatnot, and he would be sketching and drawing and painting what we were talking about. And sometimes he'd chip in, or he'd say, I'm not sure about that, or don't forget we did that in season 2, or stuff like that. But generally speaking, he would be just listening and absorbing everything in the room and then capturing it in a really cool drawing or a storyboard sequence, or this amazing kind of almost like a poster that he would do with colored pens. And then what would happen was he would take all of those images, that artwork, for each of the episodes or each of the arcs, and as the writer who was writing that arc, you would get the outline, you'd get all the meeting notes and whatnot, but then you'd get all of Dave's artwork, which would be, not only, some of the stuff he drew was like you just had to describe what you were seeing. It made your job very easy because he'd already imagined it. And then other things were just great inspiration for what a moment would want to become, or what a character that might look, if it was a new character, what a character might look like, or what a world might look like. And so I have 4 seasons of Dave's artwork for each of my arcs. That's another thing that I keep treasured. Some of it I got him to sign, and some of it I forgot to, but I certainly, next time I see him, I could ask him. But that was kind of one of the coolest things about the job was you got all of these kind of fun takeaways from it. And those are the things that, again, I'm sitting on all of this great stuff from seasons that nobody has seen, and hope someday that somebody asks me to share it so that it can get out to the fans.
Awesome. Well, this has been a fantastic, I get to get into the mind of a producer and a writer and see what it's like to be on the writing team, and this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. The last question we ask every single guest, is we're going to give you a chance to have the soapbox where you can promote anything that we might have not discussed. You can basically you can promote anything you want, say anything you want, any current projects, appearances. You just want to vent. Some people have vented. Here's your chance. You have the soapbox. You can promote anything you want to right now, or how people can contact you, etc.
Great. Well, I'm right in the middle of a couple kind of private negotiations on upcoming projects. So unfortunately, I can't really promote anything that I am working on or going to be working on, other than to say that one of the things involves a really cool, I won't even call it a reboot because I don't know that it's ever been booted, but a really great interpretation of Duke Nukem in linear media. So
holy crap, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So I can't say anything more about it than it's in the process of deal making, and I'm really excited about it and what it can become and the people involved in it and everything. So that's one thing I'll put out there on the radar. And then if anyone wants to, and then there's something else too that hopefully I'll be able to announce quickly. And all of that's to say the best way to contact me is through Twitter. I am not a Facebook person. I've never been on Facebook, nor do I hope to ever fall to that level. But I generally don't give out my email address. So contact me on Twitter if you want to chat about something or share something cool. And when I have something cool to share on Duke or this other interesting thing that I'm going to be doing soon, I will tweet it.
Excellent. Well, about Duke Nukem, John St. John, who is Duke Nukem, has been he's a regular guest on the show, and so we love the Duke. So we'll be looking forward to that news
nice.
very closely.
Good.
And hopefully he's involved because he is Duke Nukem.
Yeah.
Period. Well, thank you very much, and we'll send this to you as soon as it's up. It might be a couple weeks, depending on where I schedule things. But this will send to you as soon as it's up. Do you want me to send you a copy before we make it live so you can approve it, or do you think there's nothing that needs to be gone over with a fine comb?
No, whatever I said, I approve. So
excellent.
All good. Just put it together, and whenever you got something, yes, definitely please share it with me.
Excellent. And thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic, and I know our listeners are going to love it.
Great. Well, nice talking to you, and we will chat again soon.